So we're hearing about the state of the union, but we're not learning about the finances. And B, they never talk about the debt or the deficit. And we believe, and in fact there is a law currently being introduced in Congress calling for a State of the Nation, not a State of the Union, but a State of the Nation address to be delivered to the Congress by the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office. That's an interesting observation. And in terms of the power of the purse, where do you think that resides constitutionally in our shared separation of powers, government? What do you, anybody want to take a stab at where it really fundamentally resides?
Supposed to reside in the legislature.
I think in the Congress, doesn't it? I mean, that's where that's when, you know, the Constitution is a complex thing, but you know, our Congress has really got the power of the purse. So what do we know and when do we know it? Okay, now this is not the when do we know it, but what do we know? This is our measure of the overall financial condition of states in the United States, and what we're looking at is Illinois compared to its neighbors. This is our calculation of the net position that was mentioned in the last presentation. We take the assets available to pay bills, subtract the debt, including what was long left off of the balance sheets of the state and local governments, and that's the, this thing is falling apart on me as I go. The off-balance sheet stuff was the retiree health care and pension liabilities for decades were accumulating off the radar until finally the Governmental Accounting Standards Board required state and local governments to include those debts on the balance sheet beginning in 2015 with the pensions, and then 2018 with the retiree health care. And both numbers are very big, much bigger than the reported debt that was already being reported. So what we've had is a convulsion in accounting standards at the state and local level, and so it's kind of destroyed the time trend in the reported net position. It's hard to get a read on the real time trend in the net position, except that we've been doing this. Sheila Weinberg, who started our organization in 2002, has been doing this since 2009, doing a heroic effort, getting all the information from the actuarial reports about the pension liabilities and getting them on her own version of a balance sheet. And so we do have a valid time trend over time. And here's what it says for Illinois versus its neighbors. That red column is Illinois. And we're in a period here of a recovery from one of the worst economic and financial disasters since the Great Depression. What's the trend in Illinois look like? Is it getting better during the recovery? No, it's in trouble. And the city of Chicago is in similar circumstances.
You sure those other states are also failing to report certain things?
That's always possible, but not that we see. We think there are good jurisdictions. I become a fan of places like Utah, Idaho, Nebraska, Iowa. They're being run responsibly. 49 of the 50 states, in theory, have a balanced budget requirement of varying words in the law or in the Constitution. Illinois has what we're told is a balanced budget requirement. And so does the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago states that it balances the budget according to state law. Trouble is, in the accrual accounting results, the revenues fall short of expenses by $1 billion a year. And they borrow more money to make up the difference. And the debt's been going like this. And more and more, I think, informed observers think bankruptcy is the rational solution here in Chicago. And I'm afraid I agree with them. I'm afraid bankruptcy might be too kind. You can make a distinction between bankruptcy and liquidation. Maybe the city, and there are people that think we should develop a new Illinois and carve out Chicago area. Anyway, that stuff is being talked about right now as ways to deal with the problems that are developing. So what do we know and when do we know it? Both of those ideas are in this chart. This is a chart developed with a name in honor of Edward Kane, a professor of finance at Boston College, who wrote 2 books about the S&L crisis before we knew what hit us. Ed is the guy that coined the term zombie bank. Have you heard of the term zombie bank? It's just effectively an insolvent institution that's allowed to stay operating, and as soon as you're allowed to stay operating while you're insolvent, your incentives are to head to Vegas and take more risk in order, because If the taxpayer has a downside and you get the upside, boy, let's take it to the limit. And that's what they did in the S&L crisis. Well, I did a similar thing. I'm afraid some of our pension funds in government are in similar circumstances. They're woefully underfunded. Effectively, they're underwater. They're technically insolvent because their assets are much lower than their liabilities. And in Illinois, those folks, the benefits are guaranteed under law. So what do you think the incentives are for the pension fund and the pension fund managers if A, the pensioners don't care about the risk because their defined benefits are guaranteed by law on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm not going to lose money because the moral hazard there is similar to what the zombie bank looks like. And there's incentive to take risk in the plan, especially with managers that make more money for all their wonderful expertise managing complex equity investments. And so as taxpayers, you and I are facing the downside. If, for instance, the stock market went down, what, 800 points earlier this week, and are stocks going to go up forever? We've had, again, Illinois' disaster has been developing in the midst of this massive financial market recovery, which may not persist in the future. So it's a source of concern. Well, this zombie index is a way to actually take a look at the states and try to identify the folks that have more of an incentive perhaps to be taking more risk in their pension fund. It's reflected in the timeliness of the reporting, as well as the degree to which debt was kept off of the balance sheet, which is similar to the circumstances in the S&Ls during the S&L crisis. And there's one other element that matters. But, and I developed this ranking of the 50 states and ranked them from top to bottom. And Illinois, lower means more of a zombie, is right in there.
Hey, Bill, if you press that button in the middle of the thing, you've got a pointer.
Okay?
Yes. Cool,
thank you. There's Illinois, with other folks like New Jersey and Connecticut are in similar circumstances. And, and when I look at the pension funds, the Chicago Police, the Chicago Fire, the Teachers Retirement System of Illinois, they're dominantly invested in riskier stuff. And they feel, the incentives are, but if you and I as taxpayers are the ones on the downside and the system takes the upside, I'm afraid that's a source of potential losses that I'm concerned about. What do we know and when do we know it? Let's get another example quickly. This is AIG imploding. Back in 2008, there's the common stock price here going to zero. The equity value on the accounting side was persistently positive, even though the stock had gone to zero. Finally, the accountants threw in the towel and wiped out the equity by the end of 2009. But a reminder again that accounting necessarily isn't always delivering us the economic reality, which we have to be concerned about in pension funds as well as our governments.
So where is the bailout that they got shown?
It's not in that chart.
Right.
But let's get to your question after I get into this stuff for a moment.
Okay.
The AIG's credit default. Are you familiar with what credit default swaps are?
Yeah.
This is a very interesting instrument that effectively is a form of insurance on financial instruments. If a mortgage-backed security goes down in price, they're structured to pay the protection buyer for the fact that it's going down. It's a way to hedge your bet when you buy a financial instrument.
And it's an insurance policy on a financial instrument that you may not own.
That's also important because some people believe that turns it into a gambling contract and therefore should be illegal. That's what some people, including a friend of mine, a great guy, Walker Todd, believes.
I agree.
But there are times, my point now is that there are times in this complexity, insurance company accounting, AIG was issuing some of the most horrendously complicated financial statements on the planet. one of the jokes going around about the big banks and AIG at the time, well, nothing on the, speaking of accounting, nothing on the left is right, therefore, nothing on the left, nothing on the right is left. No one trusted the valuations on the assets, and they shouldn't have. And then, so that's, people just kind of lost confidence in the equity value. Well, one of the main reasons, other things were going on too, securities lending problems, and AIG was hit four square by the housing crisis, but this was one of the elements. AIG was issuing huge amounts of credit default swaps, protecting people against a decline in mortgage-backed securities. Trouble is, they weren't holding the capital necessary for all those contracts that they were effectively guaranteeing. There are times, however, in financial markets and in assessing governments when you can use, I think, simple cues as opposed to complicated financial analysis and still make progress. And here's an example of that. These are AIG's credit default swaps. What is that? They're not in dollars over there. All I did, and in fact I did this in 2008 at the time, I counted the number of times the phrase credit default swap appeared in their annual report. And there it is.
Interesting unit of measure.
It appeared once in 2003, twice in 2004, twice in 2005, 3 times in 2006. And then the 2007 10K, which came out in early 08, before the implosion, it was in there 107 times. The lawyers were scared out of their minds. And that was a valid signal of a booming disaster. Now let's try to do something simple for governments that are very hard and complicated to understand, especially our federal government. My job now is studying governments and government finances, and I haven't seen anything this challenging in my whole career. This is so intense. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you were familiar with, I understood that there was this Rule 56 that was put into place that allows national security things to cook the books.
Oh yes, that's another topic all by itself. And in fact, one person to read on that score, a very good guy, Stephen Aftergood at the Federation of American Scientists, has written, what he's talking about is a new accounting standard that was issued by the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board last year, I believe, allowing for national security exemptions for federal government accounting, which doesn't have to include relevant information if it's deemed to be of national interest in a national security exception. That's another reason we can't trust what we have.
What was that guy's name?
Stephen Aftergood. A-F-T-E-R-G-O-O-D. Aftergood. Along those lines, does anybody know what type of, I think I talked about this last year, what type of auditor opinion has been delivered on the financial report of the U.S. government every year since 1998?
It hasn't been filed, has it? The CAFRs they can't get anything out of DOD.
Well, that's the general, the answer is the GAO, which puts the audit opinion on the financial statements of the U.S. government, has issued a disclaimer of opinion every year since 1998. They throw up their hands, they say, I'm sorry, we just can't certify that we just can't make heads or tails out of your numbers. We can't tell the public that you're complying with GAAP. And the main reason is the Defense Department. And the problems in the accounting there. We're doing work on that score. Last year was the first time DOD went through a full quote-unquote audit. They certified for the first time that they were ready for an audit, and then they flunked it again. But at least they went through it for the first time. And hopefully that's progress, and we're following that. So let's do this with the federal government. Again, a complicated statement that's difficult to understand, and all the assumptions underneath are so difficult to try to analyze. But here's a simple indicator. And it comes from something I'm really fascinated with is text analysis, not just financial analysis or number analysis, but analyzing the text in these disclosure statements. This is the number of times the word unsustainable appears in the financial report of the U.S. government.
Oh, look at that jump.
the 2008 was a nice little hiccup, and then it's not going the right direction.
What happened in '09 there? That's,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
How did that come back from? Didn't last long.
This is, now back to financial analysis, this is our measure of, again, the taxpayer burden for the federal income taxpayer for the federal government, our net position of the federal government, which we believe on a per taxpayer basis is close to $700,000 negative, or in the hole. The total reported national debt, depending on how you define it, is reported at roughly $22 trillion. But we believe in Truth in Accounting, they don't include the Medicare or Social Security obligations as debts.
Or the 21 trillion missing?
That's another good question, and it's hard to account for missing money, so there's another, but there's,
oh, they do it all the time.
here we are since 2009, amidst an economic recovery and a financial market recovery, and the federal government's net position has been deteriorating in this decade. This is not if we go into a recession, Chicago, Illinois, and maybe even the federal government may be facing more difficulty. I try to stress to my students, we talk about yield spreads and yield curves, and what can you get information? You use a reference rate, the risk-free rate is the treasury, then you look at a company and you look at the spread and how it changes over time. It's good stuff to watch. But I caution them today that sometimes the assumption about a risk-free rate associated with the United States treasuries is worthy of question. And just being open to thinking about the risk in our federal government is worthy of being careful, I think. So, none of my students knew who this guy was. We do. So now I'm in the right ballpark. What me worry? This is so here's our federal government's version of Alfred E. Newman. This is introducing a balance sheet with $3.5 trillion in assets and 24 trillion or so in liabilities. These are the following comforting words that we hear from our federal government. There are, however, other significant resources available to the government, capital G, beyond the assets presented in these balance sheets. They include the government's, capital G, possessive S, sovereign power to tax and to set monetary policy.
In other words, we couldn't do it right if we wanted to.
You don't have to worry about your government. It can take your money away, or it can inflate the value of the money away. Which 1933. Anyway, that was 2 years ago. Here's the sentence. Here are the sentences last year. There are, however, other significant resources available to the government beyond the assets presented in these balance sheets. They include the government's sovereign power to tax and to set monetary policy. How are those sentences different from the year before? No caps on government.
Oh.
After I wrote this up, and in between they took the caps out of government. And,
Just change the V to a D.
maybe they're moving. Is it like one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind?
That or it's a typo.
More fundamentally, in light of your mission, I'd like to get your read on where do you think the sovereign power resides in the United States? Does the government possess it? Either where should it reside and where does it reside?
It should reside with the people.
That's where it should. That's where I think it belongs. The government has the power to tax. I don't deny that. The government has the power to set monetary policy. It's in our Constitution, I believe. Some people don't, but it doesn't possess the sovereign power to do so. We, the people.
The government should represent us.
Yes, the government is our servant. It's not our master.
Supposed to be.
Good luck now, the people and the sovereigns.
There's, the way the world is versus the way it should be are two different things. Along these lines, this is another fun little study.
Thing jumping here?
Yes. This is the Social Security Administration's new website a couple of years ago, where they invited people to dial up and look into their accounts. You can see your money. And here's what it says: set yourself free. Open a My Social Security account today and rest easy knowing you're in control of your future. Now this, the reason the federal government, the chief actuary and the accountants, the way they justify not including the unfunded Social Security promises on the books, they say that the government controls the law and can change it at any time. Therefore, it's not a debt of the government. How does that justification, A, it doesn't sound good, but B, how does it square with this message? Set yourself free. Open a My Social Security account today and rest easy, knowing you're in control of your future. When we presented this stuff with some of our senior friends, one person at the table said, that's just fraud. and after I wrote this up, well, actually, I made this presentation a few years ago at an economic research think tank, and one of the economists in the back of the room said, Bill, that's not a misleading message. He's standing on the edge of a cliff. So after I wrote that up, first of all, one of our friends did this to the picture.
A number of us are on Social Security. What is this My Social Security account?
It's actually still, they after I wrote this up, they took down the website. I was showing my, and then they put up a new one. They took the deceptive messaging away. And so that was like one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Okay, I hopefully we can get to this. Just a quick, speaking of what do we know and when do we know it? Can someone who knows this stuff, can they click on that? The city of Chicago claims to balance its budget, even though it really doesn't. And it also claims that it produces a financial report within the 6 months of the end of the fiscal year, as required by state law. Trouble is, in the last few years, they haven't made the deadline. And then they backdate the letter of transmittal to make it look like they made the deadline. And so we did a little research study of that.
1, 2, 3, 4. Jake and Elwood here. We're on our way over to the Picasso, and it's June 30th, 2017. We're looking for the City of Chicago's annual financial report on its due date. In each of the last 2 years, we've seen that the City of Chicago released the report after the due date, and then they backdated the letter of transmittal. The City of Chicago and the state of Illinois are in the middle of a financial crisis, and sadly, we still don't have the truth. We're flying off blind as citizens. Right, that's shit from God.
Taking this forward, yes, we are actually. Today is June 30th, which is the date that the Chicago's comprehensive annual financial report is by law expected to be produced and published for the public. Is it available? I appreciate it. Chicago's annual financial report is not available today. Today is practically the due date. Bill Bergman, Bergman. I work with a nonprofit in Chicago called Truth and Accountability. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Are you surprised, Doug?
No, this is what happened last year and the year before, and it's happening again. And it's a sad state of affairs. The city and the state are in a financial crisis, and we're flying all blind. We don't have the audited financial report that's due today. Have a nice day, Chicago. So nice to see you all again this year. We've got some two-pager discussion of Illinois' finances here, if you want to take a look In addition, I've got a sign-up sheet, but I have a morning newsletter that I do every day. If you want to sign up for it, there's a sign-up sheet here. So, anybody got any questions?
Questions?
Hi, Howard Marks here. I'm local here. Are you local, by the way?
Yes, I grew up in Chicago. I was at Gale Sayers' 6 touchdown game.
I'm sorry?
I was at Gale Sayers' 6 touchdown game. I'm very local.
So you're in Chicago?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm also Mount Prospect, Chicago, Crook County. Bruce Rauner, and of course now we've got what's his name?
J.B. Pritzker?
Pritzker is the governor now, but Bruce Rauner had a problem in getting a budget in the state of Illinois, which is the whole issue for the state calamities, which resulted in no budget. And Bruce Rauner was pushing for balanced budget, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And with respect to the balanced budget, the Mike Madigan, is it? I forget who was the Speaker of the House over there, was it?
And still is, yes.
And still is, was pushing for borrowing more and borrowing more and borrowing more. I've heard, I used to have I had a partner who was on the Chicago City Council, and I won't mention his name right now, but the bottom line is, they're there to go and give business to the banks. And
I think that's part of the network that got us into trouble. The bond houses and the banks are making money from the
But there's
situation
another-
so far. And some people think the bankruptcy solution is one that should take, those bondholders should be taking a significant haircut. They help to, they were feeding the beast. And they should probably take some of the pain in any resolution of the situation.
But there's one other thing, too. The city of Chicago, which has some very good profit centers, such as before the parking, sold their parking profit center for I forget how much.
A lot less than it was worth, I think, is the...
Oh, sure, but that was a bailout.
Mhm.
And
That's why we believe that you shouldn't, we take capital assets off the books in our version of the balance sheet. We believe you shouldn't count capital assets that could be sold and leased back, for instance, as a way to get money in the door in the short run. That's not a healthy environment. We don't do that.
I guess
Those are public assets.
the main issue, though, is that, of course, they got waterworks, which they're trying to push to go and have privatized, and there's a
That's
quote-unquote
happening in a wide
bailout.
variety of municipalities, including in southern Illinois. And whether or not that's a boondoggle for there's a company called American Waterworks that's publicly traded. That's their business model, is buying the water facilities from municipalities and making money. And if the stock's done great, the question is whether or not the stock's done great because the taxpayers and citizens haven't gotten their due in those transactions.
Precisely.
That's a concern that we have too.
My question is, thank you for your presentation, and we certainly appreciated Jake and Elwood and also Alfred E. Newman. My question is here, we're monetary reformers, and everyone in this room supports what's called the NEED Act, which was put into Congress. I don't know how much of the conference you've heard. Put into Congress 2011. You can find it on the American Monetary Institute's website. I believe it's only 12 pages long. And the website is monetary.org. And anyway, the NEED Act would create money, have the federal government create money debt-free, spend it into existence. And the provision in the NEED Act was that 25% of all newly created money would go directly to the states to use as they see fit. So it would be a way for Illinois to help. I understand Illinois is in a heck of a bad situation. I live just over the border in Indiana, so.
We're envious of you.
Yeah, but I do, sympathize with your situation here, and the same thing with the city of Chicago. And then in addition to the states getting 25% of all this newly created money every year to fund whatever, as they see fit, it would also provide debt-free financing for capital improvements for the city. So for example, schools, libraries, sewers, roads, things like that could be funded debt-free instead of the way they are right now, where you're paying interest on bonds. So that's something that your organization might consider looking at, because I remember I went to one of the talks that you gave a couple of years ago or whatever, and everybody was talking, and they said there's no way we can tax ourselves out of this. I mean, that was basically the consensus in the room of quite a few people, that there was no way to tax ourselves out of it. So you might want to consider monetary reform and join a group. Thank you.
I appreciate the thoughts. I have concerns about the government's printing presses, and I'm concerned that the government shouldn't be trusted with that authority. That's my own take on it.
Yeah, I think and number one is that if you read that book, 750 pages, or if you did some little research yourself, because you're not going to be taught these things when you go through economics school or whatever it is, actual history in the past that governments have used that power and have not abused the power. We have examples that
I live in Chicago and Illinois, and giving those folks a bank is a scary project.
Well, okay, the system doesn't work right now in Chicago and Illinois, but the colonial period, colonial governments created money and spent it into existence because England wouldn't even let us use the money that they had. We had to send it all back. So we needed a money system, and they did it, and it worked, and the country started to grow and flourish. Then during the Civil War was financed with debt-free fiat greenbacks, and that again worked. And the Revolutionary War, the same thing. It was financed with the Continentals. Now they did go worthless after billions of dollars were counterfeited by the British. So most of the textbooks kind of ignore that and think that they were worthless because the government, the revolutionary government, created them, and they created too many. But actually, the people were happy with them, and they worked real well. But they were, and it's all documented in Stephen's book. And go to the AMI or monetary.org and you can buy one of those books. Read it.
I have it at home, thank you.
Oh, well, read it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
I want to ask that completely. Oh, go
Okay. So you're an expert on government funding and government spending and the connection between the two.
I'm getting there, yeah.
Okay, and you're teaching about it. One of the vexing problems we have conceptually and also academically with our group is the ascendancy of modern monetary theory, where their theory is like, okay, government just can spend, has the sovereign power to spend, and only later, we'll think about, taxing or selling bonds and stuff. My question is, do you have to incorporate their thinking into your classes? Do you incorporate their
The students
thinking?
themselves are asking questions about these folks now. You've never heard the name before, modern monetary. The students themselves are actually interested in learning about what these ideas
Oh,
are.
so you've never heard that of MNT?
Yes, yes.
You did?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
You did not?
I did.
Okay, because I'd like to hear your position, because what I'm looking for, and some of us is looking for here, is something of a paper or some research that either confirms or refutes their position on government funding. That's my question.
Well, there's,
Do you know, or do you want to make such research?
well, there's, we could do it, I could do it. It's definitely in our rubric of our mission. Understanding accounting for money is fundamental. I'm very leery of the modern monetary theory myself personally. I have no trust that we can manage in the United States today, we already have moved to a very centralized position in controlling the total amount of money. We have a law that directs 12 people to manage the total amount of money and credit of 300 million other people. And whether or not they can do it, even if they're honest, is a very difficult proposition. How can they actually, and in fact we've learned to be leery of that centralized authority, I'm afraid, especially with the conduct of monetary policy and bank regulatory policy leading into the Great Depression almost, and the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. That was an abysmal failure on the part of our central bank. And it's a lesson not just about central banks, I'm afraid, but also about centralized authority over money in general, and to what extent you can develop a system that is insulated from discretionary authority and central authority in the government. And modern monetary theory represents I think the opposite tack, and I'm very concerned about that prospect. Steve?
Bill, we've been taking up the concern of not only the NEED Act, but we've also been taking up the concern of what's happening to farmers and how agriculture and raw materials and people producing those things in this country and around the world are taking it in the chin. And you can see that with the distribution of wealth and income towards the few. And what thoughts do you have? How do we go towards reaching the many? And let me jump ahead with that and say, one of the things we're looking at again is how parity, the concept of parity, worked from 1942 to 1952. And we find that hopeful because you can work towards solvency when you give people, as they bring goods into the marketplace, and if you pay the farmer a fair price at the farm gate, then they can afford things, and as money moves up the chain, other people can afford, and people have got the income they need to go forward, and so parity is like an insurance program to get things going. And I don't know.
I had a conversation with one of your fellow people here today about I'm gonna be studying the parity period myself and sharing your ideas with a fellow that I know, Walker Todd, the former attorney for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Walker Todd was the lawyer of reference for the Four Farmers lawsuit.
That's what. Yep.
Gene Schroeder.
Yep.
Walker and I worked together already.
I'm gonna ask him some questions.
He knows me. Ask him if he
Okay.
knows Randy Cook.
Sounds good.
All right.
I actually talked to a friend of his right before getting in here on this point.
Right.
Go ahead.
But I had one question in mind before this other conversation started, and it was a simple one. It was going to ask you to...
Simple questions are the best, because when you look under the hood on the simple ones, you find out how gnarly everything is.
But then I want to ask a different follow-up question too, so I got two. The simple one is, could you restate the point you made with the funny slides about the Social Security, about how the laws, how they, but okay, so that's one.
Okay.
Because I just didn't quite catch that.
The chief actuary of the Social Security Administration has testified that the reason why the federal government does not include the unfunded Social Security obligation, which is north of $15 trillion, depending on how you define it, that negative net position is not a liability on the balance sheet of the federal government, which implies that the federal government doesn't believe it owes us the money beyond the checks that have been printed for the current benefits. And the reason that they state that that's the appropriate accounting treatment is that the government controls the law and can change it at any time. And they can change the benefits, they can raise the taxes, they can raise the retirement age. And so therefore, it's not really a debt. And that's what they say. However, they also tell us that we're in control of our future. And it's a difficult, I think it's a problematic, we believe it belongs on the balance sheet.
Okay, thank you. So my original question my secondary question was when you mentioned about being leery about centralized creation of money. That confuses me because I think that in this country the money is not all created by the Federal Reserve. It seems to me like it's created in a very distributed way by banks everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And yet we have a law directing the Federal Reserve to control the total amount of that created money.
But who controls that?
Who controls what, I'm sorry?
The Fed and that whole process. We're arguing is that, you know, that's all private, that those are private interests, in fact, even international interests.
I believe my take on that Fed is private stuff.
Serves.
It should serve. The Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress in my head. It was created by Congress. And Congress could disband the Fed tomorrow.
They could if they weren't paid to do otherwise.
And that's the real world where we have government institutions that effectively are dominated by private interests. And that's part of my concern about central government authority. Not because it's government, but because, again, it tends to be corrupted by the big banks, you know, dominating the process.
But the big banks would not want publicly issued money.
That may not be the best reason for it to exist, but yes, I think they would be. They would be angry about it, but they don't get my sympathy for that.
Right. Hard to.
I have a question, a fundamental question about this. Two things. One, I was just taken when you had Jake and Elwood on, because
One of my all-time favorite movies.
I have my own Bluesmobile. On a grandson from Jake and Elwood in a political campaign. It was just really cool. We have a real replica of the Bluesmobile.
Chicago does have some assets.
The other one was an experience that then I'll follow up with what I want your take on this is. You were talking about how government accounting works and all this stuff. And I was in negotiations with a guy who at one time was the state director of a government agency in Montana who got fired for some strange reasons. And they put him in as negotiator on debt restructuring. And I had done a lot of this stuff. And because there was some federal law involved in how it was done and just crazy stuff. Well, I knew how these guys operated and I recorded it, but I didn't get permission. I recorded illegally because I know what I'm going to do.
Did you know it was illegal at the time you did it?
Pardon?
Did you know it was illegal at the time?
Oh, absolutely, it was illegal. I follow the mandate, when with a lawyer, be as a lawyer. Anyway, we were going through all this, and it was real contentious. And this guy says, let's stop, have a coffee break, and I want to talk to you. Because, I mean, really, I had them, because they had cooked the books on this particular account. And he said, here's what I want you to do. Use the 10-10 formula. That's what we use all the time. What the hell is the 10-10 formula? And he says, well, you just increase the projected income by 10% and reduce the liabilities by 10%, and you keep doing that until the equation works out. Right at that time, my recorder ran out and it beeped. Anyway, that was their solution, which tells me what that's minuscule compared to the massive corruption. So here's my question for you. We have now, it appears that the government has assumed the same level of corruption as certain segments of the private sector.
I share your concern.
Is it, I mean, what are we going to do about it? It's illegal, it's unethical, and it's immoral.
The legal stuff is what's scary, when the corruption gets legal.
But they own the legal system.
That's what I'm.
That's the frightening part. So for the people to take their power, here is a really fundamental toughie. How do we accomplish that under the circumstances we're in now? Because
I think it takes, you know, at the end of the day, we have a republic, we have a Congress, we have institutions of education, you have groups like yours that are thinking about stuff, and if we can think about stuff and translate and communicate, hopefully society will accommodate the common good in the equation. And we need leaders in our federal government that respect that process.
That should be the object of what we're all doing here, is trying to find a way to do this. As another example, I had a conversation with my senator, and you know, there's 77 million baby boomers. Okay?
And they're,
55 million of them only have Social Security to retire on, nothing else. What happens if they do, as you're suggesting on the floor of the US Senate all the time, save 10% of their income and didn't spend it on a monthly basis? 10% withdrawn from consumption. How long would it take for the economy to go into a recession if you cut consumption quick?
the federal government issues a measure of its unfundedness. It's something called the fiscal gap. It's a number that is computed, that's the estimate of the actuaries and the statisticians of the combination of taxing increases and spending cuts required under current law and policy to keep the debt to GDP ratio from doing what it's currently projected to do. It's currently projected to do this. And that's why that word unsustainable is used in the financial report. That this is not sustainable.
So they know it.
They know it. They do have this.
So do they think if they're warning us that it's going to happen, that's okay?
I think the administration is, every year, both parties has, some elements of it have acknowledged the issue is there. Whether or not Congress addresses it.
Maybe the solution is Soylent Green.
Not, speaking of great old movies, I'm getting depressed. I think 21. The financial report of the U.S. government.
Just that I need to throw in, because last Monday, the Alliance for Just Money had a nice meeting with a professor, Richard Robbins, and he's proposing the idea that, so he's an anthropologist, he's a historian, and he knows that a lot of changes in society came because of strikes. Strikes by labor. He's now promoting the idea of a debtor strike.
Mm-hmm.
That at a certain moment, so many people are so deeply into debt that it becomes, if they organize, it becomes a power to, you can say, well, we're going to organize a debt strike. 20% of, let's say, people that have a mortgage, and especially with student loan, they'll just say, for 3 weeks, we'll not pay the debt. Nobody will lose any, money, because if you still pay it within 3 weeks, nobody loses any money, but it will be an enormous statement about the power if, people who are
I think the people
pushed into that
realize pretty soon
statement.
that their power to do that would be severely undermined. I think
Quick.
it wouldn't fly. Among other things, collateral requirements and things in debt contracts would operate, and the government would support the system, I think. And the power of the purse includes the power of the sword, sadly.
But if you have enough people, like Hong Kong, just pass a law, you cannot have a mask.
That ain't over yet.
What happens? Everybody went to the street with a mask.
Speaking of debtors, one sort of underclass is the taxpayers. Maybe, but when do we get to a point where there should be a taxpayer's debt?
We're supposed to solve that in the political process.
Mm-hmm.
We're not.
We're not, and maybe we're not really, maybe we're getting our just desserts. I'm
I
afraid.
think we are.
And we earned our problems because we didn't speak up. We didn't try to fix things earlier. That was one of my comments. In fact, when I met Steve, it was the first time I came and talked to your group about 6-7 years ago. My observation at the end, it's easy to blame the Fed. It's easy to blame the banks for the financial crisis. But maybe at the end of the day, we've got to look in the mirror. We've got to take our own responsibility for the democratic system. And not just blame the other people that are out there. They're certainly blameworthy, but have a nice evening. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. We always enjoy your presentations and then your